Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the United Nations. I think many of you have been with us for some of the events this week, so welcome back if that is the case. And I hope you're finding it as meaningful and in honor of the victims we're commemorating as I do. I'm Melissa Fleming. I lead communications at the UN and also with my team, the Holocaust Remembrance Program. We're briefing today on the subject of hate speech, Holocaust denial, and distortion, and why challenging it matters, and it really does. We are, as I mentioned, this is organized by the program that I lead under the United Nations Outreach Program, and I'm really honored to be seated here with such a distinguished panel. Before we begin, though, could I ask everybody to put their cell phones on silent? And you can, though, tweet, post on social media, and we do have a hashtag. You'll find many of them out there, but the one that we're preferring is hashtag Holocaust Remembrance, as is on the name, in front of your nameplates. One good tweet is to get somebody afterwards to take a picture of you seated with the sign hashtag Holocaust Remembrance before that, just to show how much you're involved. I'd like to welcome our viewers on the webcast. We are broadcasting this out to the world, and to post any questions you may have on Twitter at UNHOP, so we can ensure your full participation. Welcome to all of you as well. Today's briefing is one of many events this month to mark the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, which this year has the theme 75 years after Auschwitz, Holocaust Education and Remembrance for Global Justice. For us, it reflects the continued importance of collective action against anti-Semitism and other forms of bias to ensure respect for the dignity and human rights of people everywhere. I would like to thank our civil society community for all the hard work in supporting the work of the United Nations. Civil society helps amplify the United Nations message, our values, and what we stand for in every corner of the world. We really, really appreciate your support. Today, we are going to speak about how denial and distortion of facts feed hate speech. We will look at strategies to counter distortion and denial and ask ourselves why accurate narratives of the past matter in the present and for the future we want. So let us begin our conversation with the irrefutable fact. The Holocaust happened. That the Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933 on a program of racism and racial anti-Semitism is without a question. The Nazis built a legal system to construct a racial state based on pseudoscience, drawing on the genetics movement already present in many countries. Justice became a tool to implement injustice and to encourage violent expressions of prejudice against anyone or group identified by the state as un-German, inherently or otherwise inherently inferior, unworthy of life, anti-human. Nazi law belittled, demeaned, segregated, and ultimately killed. The legal system created an atmosphere of impunity and facilitated the move towards genocide. The impact of these laws is evident. The signs above public parks refusing entry to Jewish families, the segregated schools, the limited freedom of movement, the identity cards stamped with a J to mark the bearer as a person without any rights. Again, the evidence of this is available and clear. Yet, 75 years after the Holocaust ended, despite the specter of the Holocaust not having dimmed, anti-Semitism remains, and it is growing. The same anti-Semitism that fueled the Holocaust feeds hate speech today. Holocaust denial and distortion are part of an arsenal of hate expressed by neo-Nazis, extremists, and supremacists, white supremacists. Holocaust denial and distortion diminishes the irrefutable and established facts that the Holocaust happened and how it happened, and belittles the suffering of the victims and the survivors of the atrocities perpetrated by the Nazis and their accomplices. Hate speech encourages the dehumanization of individuals and groups and is used to justify discrimination and other acts of violence. Today, together with our panelists here, we want to explore measures being taken to identify and counter denial and distortion and to challenge hate speech. We want to explore why challenging the denial of history matters. We will begin with the history of Holocaust denial and distortion, and to give us an overview, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rob Rosette. Dr. Rosette is senior historian of the Yad Vashem libraries and author of Approaching the Holocaust, Texts, Conscripted Slaves, Texts and Conscripted Slaves, Hungarian Jewish Forced Laborers on the Eastern Front. He is also a member of the delegation of Israel to the intergovernmental organization, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Dr. Rosette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here this morning, although the subject certainly is not a happy subject. In his book about the fall of the Soviet Union, David Remnick reproduces a quip that was often made there that it's not the past that's hard. It's not the future that's hard to predict, it's the past. Because history has often been the subject of all kinds of mythologization. I studied with the late Professor Giorgio Mossa about 40 years ago. He was at University of Wisconsin at the Hebrew University, and he was a great expert in Nazi society and the rise of Nazism. And if you had asked me what a historian's supposed to do when I was, in my early 20s, I would have said he's supposed to break myths. That's what he's all about. So myths about history, again, that's really part of what happens. The late Professor Yisrael Gutman of the Hebrew University used to explain that Holocaust denial is deeply rooted in what the Nazis themselves were doing, that they used euphemisms for what they were doing. They called deportations resettlements. They called human beings being put on cars pieces. They used all kinds of words other than the words that actually represented what they were doing. In addition to that, there was something called Sonderkommando 105 that went around in the last 2 years of the war, destroying sites of executions and burning the bodies to get rid of the evidence. And certainly in the last months of the war, much of the documentation was destroyed on purpose in order to hide what was happening. So in a sense, this is the roots of denial of what was going on. The late Professor Randolph Braham, who some of you may have known since he was here at City University for many, many years, also pointed out that it was already during the war itself that distortion about what had happened was emerging, especially in the communist countries. The Jewish part of the victimhood was being put aside. They were talked about victims of fascism, but not about the Jews who were being murdered. And certainly that came out even stronger in the immediate post-war years in that part of the world. Denial of the Holocaust, again, has deep roots, and it's been spoken about many times in many places. It certainly began to gain momentum by the 1970s in France, in the United States, in other places. And in some places it became very mainstream, particularly in those who were against the creation of the State of Israel, who in some ways would say, well, Israel was created because of the Holocaust. If there's no Holocaust, Israel's not legitimate, and therefore they were denying the Holocaust. That still exists, but much more today, the thing that we're dealing with is distortion and the myths that were there. And again, the myths about World War II are great, and they too began right after the war. Everybody knows that the Austrians right after the war spoke of themselves as the first victims of Nazism, and rarely spoke about how many Austrians were actually involved in the perpetration of the crimes against the Jews, not just in Austria, but again, across all of Europe. The French all saw themselves as resistance, and it's true that in the last months, a lot of people did join the resistance before the invasion in Normandy, but still, the French were not just resistance, and the Jews of France were deported to a large extent by French policemen and with French institutions. And we can say this about other places as well. In Italy, everybody saw themselves, and still today many, as rescuers, and it's only been more recently that the role of the Italian police in the deportation of the Jews in 1944 have been coming to the surface. So that it's more complex than that, of course. So again, these myths are out there. Some of them are being dealt with quite well, at least in the scholarly level, and sometimes they are really entering into the public discourse. What I wanted to do for the next couple of minutes that I have with you is talk about some of the ways distortion works. How does it work? Well, one of the things that's happening is that we see a number of nations, and it's mostly in the post-communist world, who are interested in rebranding themselves. They would like to see themselves as nations of rescuers, victims, and resistors, something that they all were to a certain extent. It's not that these things weren't there. But this is what they want to talk about and really cast themselves in this way and talk a lot less about the complicity of local people in the persecution and murder of their neighbors. And again, it depends what country and what exactly we're talking about, but these were all important parts of what was happening to the Jews and across certainly what later became the communist world. We can talk about it in all of those places. And there's a number of things that have been done in that vein. And we can talk about specific things. We don't have a lot of time, but I'll give one or two examples. And please, the examples I give don't mean it's only these countries. I don't want anybody from those countries. I'm just pointing you out, but you can't talk about all the examples.